It's late summer in 1982, and you've seen the preview for Friday the 13th Part 3, which told you a few things. The very first piece of information that the preview had in store for you was that this was very much Jason's movie.
Because these are Jason's woods.
While Child's Play would fully embrace the name change and just start using Chucky in the title, Friday the 13th would hang on to that particular superstitious day for a bit longer. Jason is named almost as much as the fact that this sequel in the Friday the 13th franchise would be in 3D, which is to say a lot. The preview also shows another detail that at the time would be innocuous, but looking back was the catalyst for what many people would see as the key to the series. This is the first movie where Jason gets his iconic hockey mask. Put on your trusty red and blue glasses as we push this film right into your lap and find out what happened to
Friday the 13th, Part 3 in 3D.
Friday the 13th Part 1 and 2 were incredibly popular, raking in $59 million and $29 million off of their rather small budgets in 1980 and 1981 respectively. While the critical reception wasn't great, that didn't stop the public from coming out in droves, which meant that there was a guarantee we would see more from this franchise. Paramount owned the rights at the time and decided to add a wrinkle to the production with the addition of 3D. This was part of a boom in the early 80s of 3D productions that also included Amityville 3D, Jaws 3D, Silent Madness, and a whole slew of others. The reason that Paramount and the Friday the 13th team chose it was because of a movie called Comin' At Ya, and it made a lot more money than it should have, presumably based on the fact that it was released in 3D. With Paramount's stature and ability to fund, they went big on it. Friday the 13th Part 3 would be the first 3D movie released by Paramount since the 50s, and would end up being the first wide release of a 3D movie by a major studio. It would show up in over 1,000 theaters nationwide, and be the first production to ever use the Mark's 3D system. And while the budget says it was just above $2 million, Paramount paid anywhere from $8 to $10 million just to install the proper equipment in movie theaters, just so they could smoothly run the film, including training for the projectionists and a sort of war room-like number for them to call for troubleshooting. With that much effort and money put into the production of the flick, they were going to get their money's worth. The poster has a 3D looking effect, and multiple scenes were filmed just to get extra 3D involved, including one that was only shown in the theatrical run. A few of the actors even recalled years later that they were told to focus more on little things that they could do that would look good in 3D, even above their own acting. Things like yo-yos and a number of objects being hurtled at the screen, and of course the infamous eyeball pop, were all designed to make the audience feel engaged. Some of the scenes ended up being very complicated and needed to be shot multiple times, like the car window being broken, a process that proved to be very expensive and time-consuming. In addition to this, they had to shoot the movie far brighter than they normally would, and even had to take into consideration what colors would be used on screen. To helm a very much more ambitious project, Steve Miner was brought back into the fold as director after his success with Part 2. Miner, an Emmy-nominated television director as well, has quite the horror resume with credits after Friday the 13th Part 3 including House, another collaboration with Friday the 13th creator Sean S. Cunningham, Warlock, Halloween H2O, and Lake Placid. The original idea of the movie was to have the final girl from Part 2, Ginny, played by Amy Steele, come back and be put into a mental hospital after the events of Part 2. Jason would track her down and kill all of the hospital staff and patients while setting up a final showdown between the two. While that sounds a bit derivative of slasher contemporary Michael Myers in Halloween 2, it was all for naught as Steele was unable or unwilling to come back to the fold.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
This changed the approach, and Ron Kurz, who wrote the previous movie, was offered the chance to write a script for the third feature, but he too declined to be involved. The first draft of the final script was written by the husband and wife team of Martin Kitrosser and Carol Watson. Watson wouldn't have much more on her resume after this, but Martin would go on to write Friday the 13th Part 5 and be the script supervisor for nearly all of Quentin Tarantino's movies. While a lot of that script was used in the final movie, Paramount also brought in Petru Popescu to help as they felt the movie wasn't mean enough. With the 80s slasher boom at its peak in the first third of the decade, you needed your slasher movie to really stand out, and this was already an established series on top of that. While it is said that Popescu added a significant amount to the final movie, he remained uncredited when all was said and done. The actors were chosen almost completely based on their looks rather than their acting ability, or how well they were known at the time. Dana Kimmel, Tracy Savage, Paul Kraka, Catherine Parks, and David Cadams were all among the main cast who would get terrorized by Jason. Larry Zerner, who plays Shelley, was found after handing out flyers. Then when it comes to playing Jason, we would get a third straight movie with a third different actor in the role, well, fourth if you count the two from part 2. British stuntman Richard Brooker would get the call several films before the role was cemented in the minds of many by Kane Hodder. At 6'3", he was certainly a tall enough Jason, but was very trim and ended up having to wear a lot of padding to seem as bulky as the character was needed. He did all of his own stunts for the movie and was lucky enough to be forever tied to the now famous hockey mask that the killer wears throughout the series. The mask was a very fluky occurrence that may not have happened if the movie wasn't being shot in 3D. The 3D effects supervisor, Martin Sadoff, was a massive hockey fan, specifically of the Detroit Red Wings, and he kept various hockey equipment with him at all times. During a lighting break, he happened to pull out a goalie mask that director Miner loved. When they shot the scenes with it, however, it appeared too small on Brooker's face, so they tweaked it to fit his face better. In addition to resizing the mask, the red triangles and extra hole punches were added to make it stand out. The mask itself was accompanied by different prosthetic masks that went under it and took several hours to apply each day. While the actors, including who played Jason, were new, one thing that stayed the same was series composer Harry Manfredini. His now iconic scores for the series have been played all over and parodied while also being released on vinyl as standalone or collections over the years. One thing that they did change was the opening credits scene. While it had been upbeat and jazzy in the past, it was a full-blown disco theme for the third movie, and it's fantastic. Manfredini partnered with Michael Zager for the tune, and he would go on to say that it was quite popular at the time, in both discos and gay bars. The opening song would become the stuff of legends, but the rest of the movie has that trademark Friday the 13th score, with all the cues that fans have grown to expect from the series after the first two movies. To that end, Part 3 marked the first of multiple occasions that the movie was shot under an alternative title, and more specifically under the name of a song from pop and rock legend David Bowie. Something that would happen again in the series. Filming on the movie changed from one side of the country to the other, where they went from Connecticut to California, where they would build nearly every building on the Vlcek movie ranch. Part of the reason that we receive Richard Brooker as the new Jason is because Jason from Part 2, Steve Daskowitz, was offered the role but was told that he would have to supply his own travel from his East Coast-based home to the new shooting location in California. He declined, and that is why Brooker was able to join the film and be the first man in the mask. The main reason for the move to California was to be closer to the burgeoning 3D technology that they were going to be using on the film. Something Paramount was sued for in the realm of $25 million by Marx Polarized Corporation. The movie, like many slasher films, would also need to be cut down in a lot of areas to avoid that dreaded X rating. While the script was changed to have a darker and more menacing feel, the gore, deaths, and some of the scenes from that script needed to be changed. One of the more famous instances of this is an alternate ending, where survivor Chris walks back to the house, only to have the door burst open and have Jason grab her hair and decapitate her. While this would later be revealed as a dream, it was deemed too dark and violent to include. This scene is also notable for using an alternative mask created by none other than Stan Winston. The mask remains in this scene and is not visible in other parts of the movie, with the entire design of the character getting an overhaul. The deaths of Andy, Vera, Edna, Chili, and Debbie all had to be cut down in varying degrees to appease the then MPAA from branding them with an unusable rating. Originally, it was going to be implied that Jason had sexually assaulted some of his victims. But several executives thought that this either went too far or that it would make Jason less marketable. Perhaps some foresight that this series still had a lot of legs to it. Friday the 13th Part 3 was released on Friday, August 13th, 1982, and raked in almost $10 million in its opening weekend. That number is significant because while it was only number 21 for the year in terms of box office numbers, it surpassed the first movie in terms of opening weekend numbers. In addition, as recently as 2020, it's the fourth highest grossing movie in the franchise. And with inflation, it's one of the highest grossing slasher films of all time. Its nearly $37 million take at the box office is impressive, but the critical reception was cold. While reviewers at the time didn't think much of it, it is usually near the top of fans' rankings for the series, and continues to be a crowd pleaser for over 40 years. Now you can say you don't need 3D glasses just to see what happened to Friday the 13th Part 3.
Seems like the world is moving on. Didn't stop to look around. Didn't give a shit if you're crashing down. You can close your eyes but not your skin. Don't believe